All right.
Hello, everyone. We're going to give it just another moment for everyone to drop in, and then we'll
gotta put my webinar on. Teachers.
All right, so I have shared my screen. As we are having people kind of join us, we thought it'd be fun to start it off with a quick temperature check, see how we're all feeling today. So if you want to go to www.menti.com and use the code 387078, you can pick, I believe I have it set up so you can pick more than one, and we'll just kind of get an idea of how we're collectively doing, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
So do we just minimize our Zoom and then we can see our own internet search? Is that how it works?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So one of the big challenges of video conferencing is when you have people navigate away, but you're going to need them to come back. Sometimes for students, we've heard stories of students getting lost during video conference meetings.
I will tell you that just seeing that picture of the corgi made me happy. It's just so happy. Looks like we still have a few folks trickling in, so we'll just give it another minute, let people kind of respond to the poll, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
I had a quick question while we're waiting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I recently did the video for, I think it was Module 2, Week 1, Lesson 3 or Part 3. But I haven't seen slides for that come through, and I thought it was actually a pretty useful session. So are those going to come through at some point?
Yes. So I am a little bit behind on emailing out the slide decks. It's Part 3 and the 2 parts from earlier this week that I still need to get out, but I am making time for that. So it'll be before the end of the week that everyone will get them in an email.
Well, as long as it's coming at some point, timeliness is totally fine.
Awesome. Yep. If you registered for the session and you watched it, then you'll definitely be able to get the slides.
And we've kind of talked about that. So I think if people are watching, say, this recording right now, the goal would be in the description of the video on YouTube to have the links of where to go. So I think that's one of our goals of when we, I think, get all the modules finished, to have that available.
Our PowerPoint is huge. So when I click to present it, it always tries to start from the very beginning. So I gotta actually go to from current slide. Sorry about that. All right, so we will go ahead and get started. Today we are going to be talking about assessment of learning and providing feedback remotely.
Yay!
Yes, such an exciting topic, but hopefully there will be some useful information in here, and we might be able to give you some frameworks to move forward with. So my name is Emma Banks. I am the Secondary Digital Learning and Computer Science Specialist, and I'm joined here by John, who I will let introduce himself before we get going.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Graham. I'm the Elementary Digital Learning Specialist. And I was just joking with Emma earlier that when you talk about, oh, we're going to talk about summative assessments, informative assessments, that is just not the most exciting language to kind of energize people. But I think when you start actually thinking about how that's going to look and how that's going to carry out and the technology tools that you can use to make that happen, then I actually think it does become really exciting. So hopefully we can shift into a exciting mode as we talk through these topics.
Awesome. So we are on the final part of the final week of Module 2. So next week we will begin Module 3. And this was a 2-week module, so if you're wondering if we've been in Module 2 forever, yes, we have. Okay, so we are going to talk a little bit about formative assessment, and then we'll talk about using assessment as learning, and then we'll talk a little bit about summative assessment, and then we'll get into kind of some of the considerations for providing feedback. And in most of these, we've built in some considerations, strategies, and tools that you could leverage to do this. So we want to frame this conversation by kind of talking about the traditional way that assessment has been done in the classroom, and then talk about shifting that a little bit for a remote environment. So this graphic at the very top kind of talks about the traditional assessment pyramid. So you would start with the most emphasis is placed on the assessment of learning. And then the next step up would be assessment for learning, and then assessment as learning. So assessment of learning is the biggest piece. In the reconfigured model, assessment as learning is the biggest piece. So like that self-assessment piece and letting students learn through assessment is that bigger one. Then there's assessment for learning, and assessment of learning is the smaller piece. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this framework, but we wanted to start by framing it with just the idea that this is a kind of a shift in thinking about how assessment is done to accommodate a remote environment. So formative assessment is assessment for learning. So some of the considerations for a remote environment, as always, is that you want to start with your purpose. You want to know what the purpose of your the purpose of your formative assessment is going to be. And then you want to allow for process time, allow for students to kind of move through the process of the assessment. Keep it built into things anytime that you can include it in as students go along. That idea of like the knowledge checks and self-assessment, emphasizing that can be really important. Putting an emphasis on feedback, you want to make sure that you're providing feedback so that students are being able to progress through the assessment, checking for understanding, those kinds of things, communicating with them about how they're doing can be along the way as they're going through the assessment. Leveraging discussion to kind of learn about how things are going for them. This is a really helpful tool for asynchronous because you can kind of ask questions and have them respond to them. And then always incorporating that assessment of social emotional learning. So don't forget to kind of assess how they're feeling, how they're doing, how they think they are performing, those kinds of things, like a temperature check for them, kind of like what we did at the beginning can be just a really easy way to look at that. And then always consider your use of data. You want to make it useful. If you're collecting this information, how are you using it and why are you using it? What are you doing with the information that you're collecting? So if like the piece that we just did at the beginning, like why did we do that? We kind of want to see how people are feeling and check the energy level of the room. We're in a virtual space, so we can't necessarily see how people are kind of the energy levels that people are experiencing. So that can be a way to kind of help with that. So those are just some basic considerations that you want to be making as you move forward. Some strategies that you could use for formative assessment for the for part, assessing for learning, would be using entry and exit tickets. You can do low stake quizzes and polls. So kind of just a quick check for how they're doing. May not have a grade attached to it, but they can kind of just see, like, check their own understanding.
So let's start with, because obviously the most important thing is
Dipstick
evaluation.
assessments are basically, the dipstick reference is like checking your oil. It should be a really quick, like, you know, I understand or I don't understand, thumbs up, thumbs down, like those kinds of quick check-ins. Those can be helpful. Again, leveraging discussion. Anytime you can build in discussion to try to understand where your students are at, that can very much be used as a form of assessment, particularly in remote environment. Because if you're doing this asynchronously, then you have a learning progression that you can watch back through and read and kind of see how the learner went through. Including visual options. This is something that it makes the learning more active, as well as providing students with more agency on demonstrating their learning. If they can create a visual representation of their learning, then that will engage them, and it will also help you to kind of assess where they're at. Checking misconceptions, just making sure that students are on the right page, they understand the directions, they know kind of where they need to be, and understand that, and correcting any of their misconceptions if they have any. And incorporating self-assessment techniques, that's one of the biggest pieces for remote learning. Students are kind of progressing through these things on their own. So what can you do to help them when they're wondering if they're on the right track and you're not there to be able to be like, yeah, you're doing great, keep going, or no, you need to think about this in a little bit of a different way. So how can you potentially build that in as you are working through formative assessments? So John is going to lead us through a few different tools that you can use for formative assessment. One thing that we want to mention is that a lot of these tools that we're going to show today could be used for formative or summative or self-assessment. It's just a matter of how you're leveraging them. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. He's going to show you some specific examples.
And you did such a good job setting that up. So I do think it's really important to note that even though we're talking about them within this specific context, that a lot of these you can use really broadly. So Nearpod, if you haven't used that before, the way that you can usually use it is in a synchronous model. You'd actually be pushing out content directly to student screens, and students can interact with it. You can set up questions, you can have images for them to be looking at, videos to be watching, things like that. So you're not actually projecting it up. So I think in a remote learning model, if you have a group kind of coming together at a synchronous time, that can be really effective. You know, not all that different from sharing your screen, but then you have that interactivity piece of it. So that's just, I think, a consideration to be making. I've used it in the classroom space when I was working with visuals. If there are things that I wanted kids to look at and it didn't make sense to put that up on a screen because the kids in the back of the room are going to have a hard time seeing some of the specific details, the kids in the front of the room are, in a sense, have that advantage that they can maybe see it better than others. But then you can actually focus on those different elements within an image. So I think if you're working on something that's very visually intensive, Nearpod's a really fantastic tool to use for that way. Plus you can get that real-time feedback. And I've also used it before and have actually projected up the feedback as students are giving that feedback. So that can be a nice kind of gauge as well. Oh, you know, 70% of you think A, where 30% of you think B. And, you know, sometimes kids will be changing their minds or whatever. So that's definitely a consideration we're making as well. But it's really a great, I think, a great way to get that real-time gauge of what's going on in the classroom. There are a lot of different tools that do that kind of real-time feedback loop, but this is one that I would definitely recommend looking at just because of the accessibility. And they did change recently, so you can actually pull outside presentations. So if you've made something in, say, Google Slides, for example, you can pull that into Nearpod and then adapt it with some of the tools. And they've actually expanded their tools a lot since I had last looked at it earlier this school year. So that's one of the things that's really, really cool. And Karen had asked about the anonymity of it. So when students get on, they sign in. So you could have that anonymity built in if you wanted to. The other piece is if you're not projecting the results on the screen, you'd just be looking at it on your device. So that's something I've done as well. I might be, driving from a tablet and walking around the classroom and talking while the students are answering a poll or looking through a picture or something like that. As somebody, working at the middle school level, that cycling around the classroom is really, really helpful. And I think sometimes if you have an image that everybody's focusing on the front, if you have to be up there pointing things out and talking through that, then you're not able to cycle around the room. But if you have, a tablet or something like that, you can walk around the room and be pushing that out and having those conversations. So the projecting, I think would be kind of like sharing. The projecting would be sharing your screen, so what you're seeing. So what you would be seeing is the feedback as it's coming in. So if you don't want students to see that feedback, then you don't have to project it that way.
There was also a quick question about if this is free and like if it has a paywall.
It does have a paywall, but I think it's features that are behind the paywall, but I'm not 100% sure. I know they had a big change with some of the features that they had available. So I'm not 100% sure. But this actually, where this is the first tool that we're talking about, this is something that Emma and I were saying is that we're hoping to, once we get through this remote learning 101 series, some of the tools that we've talked about throughout this series to actually do some, whether it's real-time training or just some video recordings that we can share and link within there. So if somebody's like, I'd really love to see Nearpod in action, then we could do a recording and kind of show it so people could see that. Because I know teachers are going to be watching through this and they're like, I want more than just kind of an overview of this tool. But I also know there are going to be people that are watching this right now and they're going to say, yeah, this isn't something I'm going to use, and we can move on. So I think just, so we can be accessible for everybody. I think that's kind of a feature that we're hoping to add in and build out. So glad we had some questions about Nearpod. Next one I want to talk about is Google Forms. So if you're a school that uses the G Suite, then probably you've used Forms before. I'm sure almost all of us have probably filled out a Google form before. So I think you'll have a sense of how it works. I think obviously there's a lot of potential beyond just kind of the regular features, but I think what's really fantastic about Google Forms is that you can create a form so quickly. And that has improved over the years. So I think in terms of going to, all right, I need to create a form to push out to my students right now, I think that's something that you could do relatively quickly. Obviously, you can be a little bit more thoughtful about it and do something that's a little bit larger and be really carefully thinking about how you're wording questions and stuff like that. But I think in terms of like a quick check-in with students for that formative piece, I think that's really one of the strengths of Google Forms is that you can set that up really quickly. The summary graphs, so I included a couple samples from one on the right-hand side. I think those are fantastic in terms of just being able to look at your feedback really quickly and get a sense of things. Whereas if you're looking through a list of your feedback, it can be really challenging. To make that feature accessible, you've got to set things up, whether it's multiple choice or checkboxes or something like that. So you really have to set up your Google form so it has that capability. So that's just something to keep in mind. There are certainly times that it's nice to have in a Google form open-ended questions or short answer questions. But if you put a multiple choice piece in there, then you do have the benefit of these graphs. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. So on the back end, if you want to do a quick formative assessment, part of it is you want students to be able to do it quickly, but part of it is also you want to be able to digest that information quickly. So that's something to keep in mind. And the other thing to also keep in mind, just something to be mentioning is that there are so many like third-party add-ons and extensions that you can use along with Google Forms and Google Sheets if the forms are dumping into Google Sheets. So that's another thing to keep in mind as well, that there are some really great tools that you can add in there, and it can really improve the functionality of it, something like Google Forms.
Okay, so moving on to using formative assessment as learning. This is a concept that in remote learning is, in my opinion, critical. There's a lot of learning that happens independently, so kind of using that formative assessment that you're doing throughout the year as a form of learning really is great for your students. So some considerations that you want to be making as you're moving through this. You want to emphasize the metacognition piece, the learning about their own learning, kind of using that formative assessment as a way for them to kind of look at how they're doing versus just for you to look at how they're doing. Providing scaffolding for them to kind of do that. Like, they're not necessarily going to know how to think about their metacognition at first. So what kind of scaffolding can you provide them that will help them to come along that, even if it's just guiding phrases or questions or anything like that, even like, how I think I did on this is ... or something like that. Using descriptive feedback can be essential in all forms of assessment, really, in a remote environment, letting them know kind of exactly how it went and what they could have done better, what they did well, those kinds of things. Focusing on the learning piece, not so much that they are reaching that, that A or that 100 or whatever it is that the end point is, but really emphasizing that the learning is a process that they're engaging in, that revision is a process. It's not you get a grade, I say great job, and then you don't think about it ever again. It's kind of more iterative than that. It should be a communication back and forth between you and the students, kind of, okay, so this is how you did. Now you're going to look at my feedback and you're going to, make changes based on that. And then you're going to resubmit, and we're going to kind of keep this as a process versus like a one-off. Involving students in this process is essential. I think I've already kind of hinted at that. Having them be actively involved in the metacognition process will really help them to enhance their own agency and autonomy and their ability to kind of lead themselves through and to problem solve and to know when to reach out for help. All of these things kind of set them up for that. And anytime you can build in that reflection piece, reflecting on how they did, how they felt about how they did, anything that might help them to improve as they move forward. I love that face on that girl. So some strategies: integrating self-assessments and knowledge checks as one of the best ways to kind of help students get an idea of where they're at and how they might move that forward. Also consider the feedback that you would provide on those knowledge checks. If you're going to look at how they did, you might be ready with some, since you didn't get this, you could check into this and enhance your understanding, and then take that knowledge check again and see if you did better. Over communicating expectations. Communication is, I feel like you just can't have too much communication in remote learning. I feel like we all know that we can get too many emails, but if you can get creative with the way that you're communicating, try to communicate in visual ways, audio ways, try to meet your learners in different formats so that they can access the information however it best suits their needs. Focus on strengths. Use the strengths that the learner has to address their weaknesses. So start with kind of some of the things that they're doing well, and then ask the student, potentially, depending on your grade level, of course, kind of incorporate them in that questioning process of how they might use their strengths to address their weaknesses and kind of use what they have to gain. Make room for sharing so that they're kind of sharing how the process is going, how do they think they're doing, things of that nature. Asking questions to, gauge how they're feeling, how they're doing, how the process is working, all those kinds of things. Really checking in with them very regularly should be the goal. Whenever possible. Even if it's not synchronous, you can kind of build those checks into their progression so that they feel like you're right there as they're going through things, even if you're not necessarily right there. And then this piece I feel like is a really big one, is just acknowledging that what they're doing is a challenge. They're improving upon themselves. And so empathizing with the fact that, you know, if they didn't do well, they probably did try and it probably was hard. And so kind of starting with that part and being like, yeah, this was a really challenging thing. You know, what can we do to think about how we might, you know, improve how the experience was or anything like that. So starting from that place of empathy. So John is going to talk a little bit about using some tools for assessment as learning.
All right. So let's look at our tools. So the first one I want to talk about is EdPuzzle. So this one's been around for a long time. I know a lot of educators love to use videos where they're, you know, showing movies, showing documentaries, showing video clips. I think bringing video into the classroom is fantastic. It's a great way to, you know, be sharing a lot of information in a really exciting and stimulating way. EdPuzzle, I think, is a fantastic way to take it to another level. So you're not just watching a video, but throughout the video, you have points, and you can kind of see it in the image there. Beneath the video, there are a couple green boxes at the bottom. So within that video, there are points that it will stop, and then it has either a question or it has a prompt. Maybe it has kind of some additional information, maybe clarifying information in there. So EdPuzzle, I think, is a really great way to use videos, and especially if you're having students access videos outside of class time, if you're using kind of a flipped model. One of the great ways to be using this is that you know that students are going to have to watch the video, but if you just had them watch the video and then maybe answer questions at the end or just watch the video, then, you know, maybe they'll watch the video, maybe they won't be super engaged with the video. This kind of pulls them into the video where they have to be a little bit more engaged. They can't just kind of breeze through. And then all of the answers are actually collected back to the teacher. So you can actually use this as something of a formative assessment. So, you know, students have watched it, they've answered the questions, and you can actually look through the answers of those questions. So I think like those are all kind of key pieces to making this really, you know, really key to bringing videos into the classroom. And then our next tool is Pear Deck. And Pear Deck is, I think a lot of people have traditionally used it in their classrooms, using it kind of as a kind of an active process, engaging students in that way. What I like is that they've they've added a student paced mode. So the little video going on the side here was kind of showing, if you're on the student side, what that student paced mode actually would look like. And obviously for asynchronous learning, students, you want to have both that level of engagement, but stuff that they're able to access at their own time. So Pear Deck will be giving them that feedback throughout, and that can be really helpful because students could access this on their own time. So if you're working remotely, then you kind of have some parameters. You know, you need to do this video, you know, do this Pear Deck before our next class or before our next meeting. But if you had a class time, and certainly you could have students do this kind of work within class itself. If you were doing maybe a rotation model, one of the features might be spending some time working on a Pear Deck about a specific topic. So a lot of different ways that you can use this both in and outside of the classroom. And then obviously there's the larger Pear Deck option that if students are familiar, if you've been using Pear Deck within your classroom, I think shifting to using it outside of the classroom is pretty easy. I think that's one of the things to be thinking about with a lot of these tools is if you have students with you and you can kind of roll out the technology and they feel comfortable with it, it's much easier if you shift to remote learning. It's been one of the big lessons, I think, this year. But if it's not something, I don't think any of the tools that we've shared are so challenging that many students wouldn't be able to get onto those platforms.
Yeah, we definitely usually try to pick user-friendly tools.
Yeah.
There's a couple of questions. Gordon asked, what videos can be used with EdPuzzle?
So EdPuzzle, you can pull in videos from YouTube, I know. Vimeo, I think you can as well. You can also upload your own videos. What I really like about it with in terms of when I've used YouTube videos in the past, sometimes it's like, oh, there's this video that's an hour long, but it's really only this one segment of the video. You can actually chop it down to just that segment. So when you direct students on there, they're not having to navigate to a specific part in the video. It's just going to have that one video, and then they're going to be progressing through it. The other thing is, if you have that video chunked up into sections by questions, they can't move forward. They can't just answer the question and go on to the next one. They can go back and rewatch that section, but they can't, be jumping all around the video.
Okay, awesome. And then Michael Lane, you've asked, how do we ensure the efficiency of assessments in an asynchronous environment? Do you have like a little bit more context you want to provide for that? Because that's just like a very big question.
Sure, I might have had a typo in that. I'm looking for efficacy. Mainly, how do I ensure that my assessment is actually accurately measuring what I want it to do? Certainly, I think pre-teaching a lot of the technology answers that piece of it, but I have students who have been working in conjunction with their parents to complete assignments. I work at the special ed level, so I was in high school, and so I was putting out some assignments that were connected to, say, annual goal progression around mathematics. But the students working with the adult in their home, I can't really guarantee that those answers are, in fact, that student's answers. So I'm looking for solutions around that.
Well,
that's a challenging one.
Yeah. That's definitely a challenge. I don't think either one of us have an answer to right at this moment, but we'll certainly keep that in mind. And Julia, you mentioned asking if there's a place that evaluates the factors that basically make up a good app or a good tool. I would say that there definitely are some. I don't know that any of them are super comprehensive, but I think what you would want to do is kind of do some looking for ones that fit your specific context, because that's going to be the most valuable. There are all sorts, but a lot of them will focus on like good apps for pre-K to third grade, or for this subject, or for, college students, or, so you kind of need to look around for what application they'd be used in. But
and I think
I
think one of the things that's really important is if you have a level of transfer, so if kids are learning an app and it's something that they can use across content areas, and that's really helpful really for everybody. If one person can kind of roll it out in their class and other teachers know, oh, your kids that you've been using EdPuzzle, maybe I should use that with my kids, because they're already going to know about it because they've been using it in their class. That's something that I think at all grade levels, if you're able to leverage that to some extent. Yeah, and I think the whole point of just trying to stick to a few, what I think about technology is a lot of times you can use it to get students kind of excited because stuff is new. You kind of have to find that balance between, it being new and it's a new thing that they need to learn, and is there a certain level of overwhelming, like, oh, this is new, and then this is new, and this is new. So sometimes those new things can kind of stimulate some excitement, and you can kind of leverage that excitement, but sometimes all of that new can also be overwhelming for other students. So I think that's one of the things, and it really depends on your demographics you have in your classroom. So it's just a thing to be kind of keeping in mind. I know that there are students that I've had in the past, they're like, oh my gosh, you're showing us another new thing. And sorry, guys.
I like to use the strategy of like a rotating type of situation where like I might have 4 tools that I use regularly, but I'm constantly like checking out other tools on the side and then evaluating whether or not I think that one of these should replace one of my like core. And then if I feel strongly enough about it, that's when I would actually consider like bringing it into what I do. So that can be a decent way to try to frame it, is to explore all sorts of things, but really like be mindful when you actually decide to like implement or change out something or add something type of deal. So, okay, great questions. Feel free to keep adding them in the chat if you end up having more. We're going to move on to talking a little bit about summative assessment. So that would be that assessment of learning. So in our reverse pyramid, the formative assessment pieces are the bigger pieces, and then the summative is like that top triangle. So just keeping that visual in mind. So a few considerations to be making about your summative assessment setup. Again, I always like to put this, I feel like you can't state it enough to know the purpose of why you're doing it and what you're going to do with the information. Focus on the essential learnings. That's something that can be really kind of challenging in a remote environment because you almost want to assess everything. And that's great in the formative idea, you know, to constantly be, you know, implementing those formative assessments. But when you start to get into those summative, bigger assessments, you really want to not assess everything, but focus on those essential learnings, the enduring understandings. Like, what do you really expect your students to walk away from the class with, and measure those versus everything else in your summative. Integrate performance tasks. By performance tasks, I mean providing your students with ways to perform their understanding or their learning. So allow them to create, allow them to demonstrate, provide them with ways besides quizzes and essays to be able to show that they've learned. Consider using like an e-portfolio or building, you know, a website that has some tools on it. Of course, depending on the age of your learners, I'm secondary, so I always go with some of those higher level things. John's going to show us a few examples that I think will be helpful as well. But thinking about those performance tasks, what can they perform that will demonstrate their learning that might be more effective than, you know, A through D and picking which one's right. Modularize whenever possible. Provide opportunities for to work through the summative assessment in pieces versus having it be like one bit, or if it's one big thing, then have it be in series so that it's not like a 3-hour task or something like that that they have to sit down and do. That applies to all instructional design for remote learning. You always want to try to bite-size piece everything that you possibly can so that students can kind of go at their own pace whenever possible. Again, leveraging discussion. Discussion can be a really effective form of assessment in any context. You can really gain a lot of knowledge about what your students know by asking them to either explain concepts to you or to other students or to, you know, a community, like anything that you can do to have them, you know, take them from the learners to the teachers, basically. Have them teach what they learned. That's really a great way for them to demonstrate that they have learned. Academic integrity is a big consideration. I think this kind of speaks to what Michael was talking about earlier with some of those things, because it becomes very much a responsibility thing of the student. And so just like I consider it to be really similar to digital citizenship, because it's something that needs to be integrated. Your academic integrity expectations should be integrated into your classroom norms, your classroom expectations, just like you expect your students to be respectful to others and to you, you should also expect them to use academic integrity. However, that concept is not necessarily a no-brainer. So anything that you can do to really address the importance of it, especially in the remote environment, is really effective. If your students are not familiar with the concepts, you might have to kind of really, I know that most students are familiar with what plagiarism is, but academic integrity is like a step up. It's being conscious of the responsibilities that you have as a person when you're using other people's academic work and submitting work as your own and things of that nature. Kind of gets into copyright and things of that nature. I think John and I are probably going to end up talking a little bit more about this later in the summer because it keeps coming up as a hot button issue. So you can look for that later on in the summer, but trying to just be mindful of the needs for academic integrity in a remote environment can be really important. And that, I think, particularly plays into the summative assessment, because, you know, the formative assessment is kind of like an as-you-go kind of thing, and you'll likely be able to tell if something's up throughout formative assessment, but summative assessment can be a little bit different. And so kind of establishing those expectations before engaging in that can be really helpful. And of course, I'm sure you all know, but providing as many options for students to demonstrate that they've learned is really effective. Some students, if you were in our session yesterday, we talked a little bit about learning styles. And so kind of trying to accommodate those the different ways that people learn, the different ways that people can demonstrate their learning and understanding, and trying to accommodate as many as what you reasonably can. I was gonna say, is it gonna move? So I swear I hit the button on time, you guys, and it just is the longest lag. Okay, so some strategies. I kind of talked a little bit about this. Integrating academic integrity into your instructions, into your norms, everywhere that you possibly can. Explicitly state what it is and what their responsibility to it is. If you feel strongly enough about it, or your learner base seems like they need it, you could also emphasize consequences for not meeting that, because plagiarism in pretty much every school has consequences. So kind of talking about some of those higher level things can help to set some of those standards. Assigning those performance tasks that allows students to show what they know, you know, really give them that ability to show me what you know. I don't care how it looks, just make sure that you incorporate these elements that demonstrate that you learned about Abraham Lincoln, or, you know, whatever it is. Use that project-based learning, have them work to a bigger goal, try to keep it problem focused or solution focused, have them actually work towards something using projects and a long-term thing. This is where the modularization could come in really handy, because then you could have your modules moving forward to this bigger cumulative project. And focusing on that creation as demonstration, allowing the students to create, compile, build. I want to emphasize that compile, because compiling information in a virtual format is very similar to like that tactile thing of like actually printing out a research report or something like that. So, you know, having them build an e-portfolio can be a really engaging experience for students, and that's just an example, but that compilation of information can be really great. John is going to talk a little bit about some tools. Apparently our transition slide is gone.
All right. So yeah, Emma had kind of touched on portfolios. So I think that's a really important model to be thinking about, is portfolios and projects in terms of looking at those summative assessments. So the example that I have here, Book Creator, which again, I should reiterate, this is something you can use in a wide variety of different ways. What I like about Book Creator is that it's really easy to learn. I have seen other people roll out Book Creator with, I'm trying to think how the young I've seen, like first, second grade, within like a class period, you know, 45 minutes or something like that, you know, touching on all the main features. So, I mean, that type of ability to roll it out really quickly so kids feel really comfortable using it, I think that's huge. But what I like about Book Creator is it allows them to integrate a lot of variety of media in there. So you can pull in text, whether it's text that you've written somewhere else. I've seen students write things in a Google Doc and then they copy and paste the pieces, in which case they're kind of using Book Creator as a almost like a publisher type program. You can pull in images, of course. They've got a nice built-in copyright image search on there, so that can be helpful to avoid some of that. Video, they can either make a video while they're making the book, take a video right then, or they could make a video at another time, or if they were doing a portfolio, if they had a video, they could bring that video in as part of a portfolio. And then the audio, they can actually record an audio piece, so they're talking, either reading a passage or just giving an audio reflection on something. So it's a nice button on there that you can just push and it will play. So really great features. And I mean, there's even more beyond that, but I think those are kind of the biggies for Book Creator. And like I was saying, I think if you're having students do portfolios, even if you have them working in other places, they could, even if something that's physical, if they're doing a drawing. So the example that I have here, what I really liked about it is most of that stuff was done off of technology, and they just took pictures of those different things. So I think that could be, a way to pull those different components together into one place, which is great. Nice way to celebrate learning, nice way to, look back on progress that you've made. And that whole process of kind of gathering stuff into a portfolio, I think is a really, is a model that's really important for students to be using. The other piece I should just mention here is if you do student-led conferences or something like that, this would be a nice piece that you could use for pulling together the materials for a student to share in a student-led conference. And then if they feel really nervous about talking or sharing things, they've got videos and audio pieces that they could add in there that can kind of do that heavy lifting for them. And I should say lastly, I don't have an example here, but I have seen some teachers do some really cool stuff around creating work packets within Book Creator and then sharing those to students. So students are going in and having to change pieces or add pieces in there. So I think that's another way to think about leveraging Book Creator, which I believe ties nicely into my next one, which is Seesaw, which is a largely, I think, elementary. You could use it, I mean, certainly up in middle school, high school if you wanted to. I think people tend to use other learning management systems. But Seesaw, one of the things I like, and I actually included an example in here that I saw a kindergarten teacher do. And what I like about this is an activity that she pulled from the Seesaw library. So it actually has like the name on there. So if you like this example and want to use it, then you can seek that out. But they have a library of all kinds of activities that you can pull down and use right within your classroom, make your own copies, modify them, change them. And this particular example, what I think is cool about it, and I saw this in a kindergarten classroom in March. And what they were doing at that point was something very similar to this. So they had in the upper left quadrant of that, they were needing to move the letters, the G and the O around. So those were free for them to move. In the upper right quadrant, they had to circle the word go. In the middle one, they had to record. So you can see each of them, it has those little buttons, which are prompts for them. So the teacher had, over the course of the year, had rolled out those different parts of Seesaw. So those students, when I was there, she was rolling out a new part. I think it was the recording one, maybe like the audio recording piece of it. But they already knew the drawing tool and the text typing tool and stuff like that. So even though this seems like, oh my gosh, how could a kindergartner like do all of this stuff within the program? Certainly they could do it, but how, what would be an effective model? And that seemed to work amazingly, that she had, each time she did one of these word works for the week, she would add a feature or do something a little bit different, and then she could address that, but the kids had previously used the other features. So it was a good way, I think, to roll out that technology bit by bit, and also to be kind of getting at what it is that you wanted them to do in terms of an assessment. So I think it was really fantastic to see. I wish I had like a video that kind of demonstrated that, but really great model to use. And then on here, I do have a link if you're thinking about using Seesaw for different kinds of assessments. They have really, really great training. So I linked on here to ones specifically for assessments that you could access if you are interested.
Okay, we are going to kind of quickly talk about providing feedback. It's 11:51, so we're running kind of short on time. But, okay, so providing feedback is very familiar to, I'm sure, most of you. But there are some considerations to make in regards to remote learning. You want to think about how you're going to provide feedback. Is it going to be via email, phone, learning management system, Google Comments, anything like that. How is it going to be done? Keep it simple. Keep those essential understandings in mind. Use feedback to encourage autonomy and independence. Try to provide them with their next steps, how they might improve, move forward, kind of guide them to their next step. Emphasize the why of assignments. Why are they doing this? Why is it important? Those kinds of things can help feed that intrinsic motivation that is so important to remote learning success. And be purposeful with your feedback. Don't just say, great job, although emphasizing what they did well is really good, but try to be really descriptive with what was it that was so good about this, or what was it that made it so that it needed to be improved. Try to keep those kinds of things in mind and be very purposeful. That will save you time, as well as your students are more likely to read it instead of just, okay, I'm done with that, I'm going to move on. So using that descriptive language, keep it personalized. If you know something about your student and you could incorporate that into your feedback, say they really like soccer and they incorporated something about soccer in their, in their writing or something like that, you might point to that as in your feedback to help them to feel like it's personalized. Consider using emojis, memes, and GIFs. Anything that you can do to put a smile on their face, help them to get a visual representation of what your thoughts are or how they did. That can just help to keep it fun. Framing feedback can be really helpful for students to understand kind of where you're coming from. In a remote environment, it can be really easy to feel kind of targeted and attacked because you're already isolated. So thinking about what you can do to frame the feedback. Okay, we're going to do warm and cool feedback. So I'm going to give you some warm feedback, and then we're going to talk a little bit about stuff that's a little bit cooler and that needs a little bit more work. And so by framing it that way, then they're expecting the cool part as well. So, and then I always like to recommend leveraging the compliment sandwich, which I can't even remember the origin of that right now, but it has stuck in my mind for years. That's the idea of using something good on both sides of something kind of not so good. So let them know something that they did really well, then let them know something that they could improve on, and then emphasize again something else that they might have done well, so that you're not leaving on a negative foot. You're kind of starting with something good, letting them know something they could improve, and then also re-emphasizing, but you did this really well. So, just work on that middle piece. Okay, so John is going to quickly talk about a couple of tools for providing feedback, and then we'll almost be done.
Emphasis on quickly. So Flipgrid, if you haven't used Flipgrid before, it is a video recording tool. So you send out prompts to students and they record themselves with the video on their device, making a response. So it's a great way they could actually demonstrate things in real time. So I've mentioned like phys ed teachers using it, and I know some people have and had success with that. But you could also, in terms of like an oral assessment, that's kind of another piece in there, like students being able to talk through things. Sometimes you have those students that just love to talk and explain. But I think in terms of feedback, what I think is really nice about it, within a classroom context, students could give one another feedback, but then also the teacher can give audio feedback within Flipgrid. Really user-friendly platform. Moving on to the next one, which was Google Comments. This is probably something a lot of people are aware of, but if you're using Google Apps in your classroom, I think Docs and Slides especially, there's the comments feature that you can add on the side, and that can be a really nice way to build a back and forth with students. But you do have to train the kids to some extent that that's a feedback method that you're going to be using. And I should also add that there are some really cool add-ons that you can get. I think ReadWrite does one and Kazina does another one. So you could actually do audio recording feedback if you find that the typing's a little time consuming, or maybe students are a little more responsive to audio recordings. And I should say that this comments feature, this exists across a bunch of different platforms. This isn't a Google exclusive thing. So probably if you're doing kind of web-based content creation that way, a lot of times there are comment potential in there. And you also, this is something definitely in Google that you can give people just comment access. So that can be another way that you can leverage comments.
All right. So we are at our checklist. And then we've got one more thing real quick after this, but just in general, when you're thinking about assessment and providing feedback, starting with purpose, leveraging discussion, leading with empathy, integrating self-assessment, using the positive whenever possible, enhancing that social emotional learning component, and always consider the tools that you might use and which ones would be the best fit. And so we are going to do an exit assessment. And John has the link to it, I think.
Yeah, so I have an example here. So this is something if you wanted to use it in your classroom. I do have the link to if you want to make a Google Doc copy. I love using emojis as a way to kind of gauge where students are at, where people are feeling. But we're going to actually have an activity we're going to have to go out to do. So if we go to the next slide, the link there is up at the top, although I'll need to paste that in the chat. Let me do that. I should have had that all set for you guys.
I was gonna say, you can't do it in the slide. It'll only let you click it.
Yeah, so you'll have to go out to do it. Loading slowly. All right.
The cool part about this, though, is that you'll see when you see the options here, it actually loads the emoji in the results. So this is a snapshot of the results that John would see on his end after you've all filled this out. So if you had your students do this, you could kind of actually see like what percentage of your students are feeling what way and how they felt about, like you could ask, you know, how they felt about the assignment or, you know, how they felt they did. Those kinds of things can really make a big difference.
I think the big point to make here is if you're going to do this sort of check-in with students, you really have to set up a system that's going to work for both them and for you. So I think that's one of the things that's really, really key. So that's what the form looks like. So you can click on this little checkbox on there. So you can click on any of those, and then when you click submit, that will go in. And actually, Emma, I'm going to take control of the screen so I can show on the other end what it looks like.
And Tatiana is asking if they are able to and allowed to copy it.
Oh, I don't think I have it set up to copy. If you shoot me an email, I can share it with you. It was pretty easy to set up. Maybe I can even share that before we get off here. But you can see on my end what it looks like. So I can really get a pretty quick gauge that it seems like people are pretty happy. Thankfully, nobody's sad. Some people are. And one of the things that I think is funny about emojis is that to some extent they're open for interpretation. So it's always a fun process to go through with kids. So I actually put in option 1 and 2, and in that you could put in a word if you wanted to. So you could pair a word with an image. The emojis, so you had the bigger visuals, the images that you're clicking on, but you can also copy and paste emojis into that Google form, which that was a feature I was just figuring out this morning, because I originally had just the pictures, and I was like, I wonder if you can just put the emojis in there and that they'll show up, because obviously this is much easier if you can see the images on there. So I do also want to say that I have had some teacher friends of mine say that they had used a model similar to this kind of to check in with their students. And they said it was really helpful because they had some students that were having a really hard time, and it allowed them to check in with them. So another thing to kind of keep in mind, it can be used at several different levels.
Okay, so we are at 12. I just want to see if anyone has any questions. I'm sharing my screen with the information to the PD certificate, just in case you haven't done it before. Once you choose your session, it's going to take you to a new section of the form where you'll get the link to the certificate, but you'll still need to answer the question after that and hit submit on the form in order for the whole process to be completed. Julia was asking, John, did it give you the ability to resize the images when you put them in?
I didn't because I think it does, but I wasn't doing it. Let's see.
I think you can also actually upload an image. So if you wanted to
Yes.
save it as like a PNG or something, you could probably get it a little bit bigger.
That's kind of what I figured. I figured for resizing, image makes most sense, but it'd be kind of convenient and nice if you didn't have to do all that.
Right, no kidding. And Tatiana asked, what type of question in forms is it? Was it a checkbox, John?
Yeah, so I did checkbox for this so people could pick more than one, but you could do multiple choice as well.
Any other questions?
I have a question that doesn't relate to this at this point in time. It's about posting work for students and collecting work from students. So I'll wait until the end.
Well, this is the end, so I think you're
It's
good.
okay to ask now?
Yeah, go ahead, ask whatever.
I'm exploring the Bitmoji scene and doing a Bitmoji classroom. And so, however, in our school, we use Google Classroom to collect work from students. And I'm wondering, before I pursue this further, if there's a way to align the two so they can click on something like, you know, an assignment, like linked to the Bitmoji classroom and open it up and then just be able to type directly on that and click on submit into Google Classroom.
There might be some additional steps is what I'm thinking,
Yep.
but you definitely could have a Bitmoji classroom set up so it would have hotspots. So I think you probably could get them close, maybe not right into the document, but you definitely could direct them to Google Classroom and probably this specific post.
Okay.
Yeah, even if you just had an assignment that said hit submit to like say that you've completed it, and then you could go back and look at how they did and then give the grade, you'd still be able to have like a house for that assignment, so to say, in Google Classroom.
Okay. So I'll keep looking and keep exploring with it then.
That's good.
Yeah.
Good for Emma and I to be thinking about as we plan this Bitmoji classroom session.
I know, I think we're gonna have to, like, with so many layers of it, maybe we'll call it a Bitmoji extravaganza or something. But okay, well, you all have been great. I'm gonna be respectful of everyone's time, recognizing that it's almost 12:05, so we'll go ahead and end things, but we will be back again at 3 talking about self-recording and video tutorials. If you have any like thing that you want to troubleshoot or need help with, it's a help session at 3 p.m. and then we'll be back again next week with the 3 parts of module 3. Have a lovely afternoon.
Bye, everybody.